Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on an ASMR journey into the world of a classic novel, Emma by Jane Austen. I made a talk about Austen's life and work last year, and I mentioned then that I'd be happy to talk more about her individual novels, so I thought I'd start today with Emma. It's not perhaps an obvious choice, it's not Austen's most popular novel, and not every Austen fan likes the character of the heroine, Emma Woodhouse. However, I think it's one of Austen's wittiest novels, and it's also one of her cleverest. It has, at its heart, a rather sly and ingenious plot, as well as a lot of very funny dialogue and amusing characterization that makes it a highly satisfying read. So in this talk, we're going to take a look at Emma the novel. We'll discover the major themes and characters within the story, and I will also talk a little bit about the plot. I'll try not to give too many of the twists and turns away, but if you haven't read it or watched one of the many adaptations, and you're planning to do so soon, then that's perhaps worth bearing in mind before you start listening. As usual, there will be a few images on the video slideshow to accompany our topic, but there's no need for you to look at them if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the witty world of Jane Austen's Emma. The novel was published in 1815, and it was the sixth full-length novel that Austen had written. Of those six, 3 had already been published, and they'd been greeted with great enthusiasm by both the fashionable literary world and the wider reading public. This means that by the time Austen wrote Emma, she was an author who had matured in her literary experience and grown in her literary confidence, and this combination allowed her to explore with her next novel and take a few literary risks with it. I am going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like, Austen wrote, and in creating Emma Woodhouse she did just that. Emma isn't a typical Regency-era heroine. She's not particularly modest. She's not particularly humble. She's actually rather spoiled and self-involved, frequently conceited and judgmental, and she has rather entrenched notions of superiority. So she doesn't really fit the picture of the pious, bashful heroine that the female protagonists of the age were supposed to embody. Instead, Emma is rather captivated by what she considers to be her own brilliance and insight. She thinks she has incredible perception and awareness of the human heart, although in reality she is in fact painfully lacking in awareness and is often completely oblivious to what is really going on, both in her own heart and in the hearts of others. Emma is in fact a superb portrayal of a clever and privileged 20-year-old whose overweening self-confidence stems from the fact that she's not yet really encountered many setbacks in life and hasn't learnt enough about the world to discover that there's more to it than simple black and white notions. As such, I think Emma is a marvellously well-observed and true-to-life character because she has so many flaws. Her faults make her very lifelike and believable, but for some readers they also make her very irritating. She's not as charming or as popular as Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine of Pride and Prejudice, or the Dashwood sisters in Sense and Sensibility. But by 1815, Austen knew she was a good writer, and she also knew she was a popular writer, and so she took a leap of faith with Emma and created a protagonist whom, while she might not fit the traditional mould for a heroine, does absolutely capture the quirks and complex characteristics of a real-life human being. That is what makes Emma the novel so compelling, so enjoyable, and so authentically funny. In keeping with her heroine's high opinion of herself, Austen introduces the reader to her leading lady in the very first sentence of the novel. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world, with very little to distress or vex her. This opening paragraph is in itself quite a radical departure for Austen, because in her 3 previously published books, the heroines had all begun their stories in adverse circumstances. At the start of Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood have just lost their father and are about to lose their family home, and with it their current social status. Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice does have a comfortable existence, but it's also a very precarious one, because her home, the estate of Longbourn, is entailed upon her male cousin, which means that in the event of her father's death, she, her mother, and her 4 sisters will immediately be left homeless and without sufficient income. By contrast, Fanny Price, who's the heroine of Mansfield Park, makes the reverse journey at the beginning of her story. She's transplanted from her modest and rather shabby family home to the grandeur and elegance of her cousin's family seat at Mansfield Park. So on the surface she appears to be, materially at least, quite fortunate. However, with the exception of her brother William, Fanny has never received any unconditional love in her life, and this makes her extremely timid and anxious. Her anxiety is intensified by the constant reminders she receives from nearly every member of her new adoptive family that she's the poor relation and that she's very inferior to the rest of them. So Fanny begins her story feeling isolated, traumatized, and pretty much depressed. By contrast, Emma Woodhouse starts her story wanting for absolutely nothing. She's wealthy, she's happy, and we quickly learn she's also very much loved. She's doted upon, in fact, by both her father and her former governess, Miss Taylor, who at the start of the novel has just married a local merchant, Mr. Weston, and become Mrs. Weston. Emma's also loved and admired by her wider circle of friends and family, who live mainly in and around the village of Highbury, and so the only obstacles she faces are the ones she encounters in her own character. Her own flaws provide the setbacks that will bring her tribulations. They are the challenges that must be overcome as she progresses through the novel. As such, Emma is a story of acute psychological truth, I think, because for many of us, the main obstacles that we face in life come from within, not from without. This makes Emma a novel which is incredibly ahead of its time in many ways, because it highlights the role that every human plays in their own destiny, the choices they make, and the knock-on effects of those choices to bring about success or failure, happiness or misery. Later writers would of course develop this theme and take it into darker and more melancholic territory, but Austen, I think, was one of the first to delineate it so clearly. However, she handles her theme with a light touch, playing to her strengths and using her perceptive insight into human behaviour as a showcase for her particular talents of satire and wit. Consequently, Emma is an absolutely hilarious novel. In the grand scheme of things, nothing very spectacular happens within it in terms of plot. There are no breathtaking adventures or melodramatic denouement. It's simply a carefully observed and bitingly funny portrayal of a particular set of people living in a particular village in a particular era. However, within these narrow confines, Austen sheds a brilliant light on human thought and action, on how people judge each other and themselves, and also why they behave in the way that they do. And because Austen does this in such a truthful and authentic way, that in itself is enough to fascinate the reader. The foibles, the misunderstandings, the little mysteries that circulate around the heart and mind of Emma Woodhouse and her circle become utterly compelling under Austen's pen. The story of Emma, then, revolves around Emma Woodhouse herself and her immediate circle. At the centre of this circle is her father, Mr. Woodhouse, who's a kind but very fretful hypochondriac, and who appears to be much older than his actual years. There's then Mrs. Weston, previously known as Miss Taylor, the former governess, who has looked after Emma since she was a small child, Mr. Weston, who is Mrs. Weston's new husband, Harriet Smith, who becomes a friend to Emma, and who's a naive but exceptionally pretty young lady from a nearby boarding school, Mr. Elton, who is the young and handsome vicar of Highbury, and Mr. Knightley, who is the squire of the local manor house, and who is a long-standing friend to the Woodhouse family. Beyond this immediate group, there's also a wider circle of social acquaintances within the village of Highbury, the most notable of whom are Miss Bates and Mrs. Bates. Mrs. Bates is an elderly lady, the widow of the former vicar of Highbury, and she's a genteel lady but has become somewhat impoverished since her husband's death. Her daughter, Miss Bates, is a middle-aged spinster who is very good-natured but extremely gossipy, and she provides the novel with a great deal of its humour through her interactions with the rest of the characters. As I mentioned before, at the beginning of the novel, Miss Taylor, Emma's former governess, has just married Mr. Weston, and Emma prides herself on the fact that she believes she foresaw the match and helped it along. However, because Mrs. Weston now has her own home and is no longer living with Emma and her father, Emma feels the need for a new companion, and so she befriends the young and impressionable Harriet Smith. Harriet is a parlour boarder at the nearby school for young ladies, and she's very pretty and very well-mannered, but she's also rather ignorant and doesn't have a particularly steady character. So Emma decides that she's going to improve her. Her plan is to educate Harriet's tastes and bring her forward into good society. And all of Emma's circle think that this is a delightful and charming idea, a sort of very charitable act on Emma's part. Apart from Mr. Knightley. He, as Austen tells us, is pretty much the only person who ever points out Emma's faults to her, and he has serious misgivings about her friendship with Harriet Smith, because he believes that it will spoil Harriet and make Emma even more conceited than she already is. Emma does in fact lead Harriet astray fairly quickly. When they first meet, Harriet has had her head turned by a local gentleman farmer, Robert Martin, whom she's met through her acquaintance with his sisters at boarding school. Mr. Knightley thinks that Robert Martin is a very worthy match for Harriet, but Emma, in her snobbishness, thinks that Harriet can do better, and she encourages her to dismiss Robert Martin from her thoughts and focus her attention instead on Mr. Elton, the dashing young vicar. Much to Emma's delight, Harriet soon develops a fairly intense crush on Mr. Elton, and she thinks Mr. Elton is returning the passion because he's so gallant and always appears to be so encouraging when he's with the pair of them. However, it eventually transpires that it's not Harriet who is the object of Mr. Elton's marital ambitions. He actually ends up proposing to Emma instead, and there's a marvellously funny scene that takes place in a carriage when the pair of them are being driven home together after a Christmas party at Mr. and Mrs. Weston's, and Mr. Elton, having drunk a little too much of Mr. Weston's good wine, takes it upon himself to propose to Emma, and Emma is absolutely taken aback by this. She's aghast. Mr. Elton is in turn mortified by the realization that Emma wanted him to marry Harriet, and the pair of them are stuck in this carriage together, both fuming until they reach the vicarage and Mr. Elton escapes. The reader gets to enjoy the hilarious discomfort of both the characters in this scene, and Austen writes them with such psychological realism and also drops enough sly clues about Mr. Elton's true feelings along the way that a perceptive reader already knows how matters stand before Emma and Mr. Elton do. So in this case, Mr. Elton's declaration might not come as a surprise, and in fact becomes a source of satisfaction to the reader, who has already guessed what's going on and knows the true state of the characters' feelings before they do. However, even for a reader who hasn't spotted what's really going on, the carriage proposal scene is still very entertaining, and either way the reader is left chuckling by the indignant dialogue that takes place between the two of them. As a novel, Emma is full of these entertaining, emotional revelations. The story develops through a series of small misunderstandings and misconceptions, both by Emma and sometimes by other characters as well, that lead people astray and become the catalyst for a great deal of humour in the book. I don't want to describe too many of these revelations because half the fun of reading it is discovering them for yourself, but they all involve matters of the heart. People who think they are in love, people who are pretending to be in love, and people who genuinely are in love, but perhaps just never realised it. Austen skillfully sets up all of these intertwining plot points through the novel, and she plants subtle psychological seeds in pretty much every major interaction between the characters, so that when the moment of enlightenment comes and the truth is revealed, the reader can again either enjoy being one step ahead of the characters, or alternatively be struck by the surprise of the outcome. As a result, the experience of reading Emma is quite similar to reading a classic murder mystery by someone like Agatha Christie. There are lots of puzzles to solve in the plot, with plenty of clues along the way and also plenty of red herrings. And when the denouement is finally revealed, everything fits together perfectly and makes sense. For this reason, Emma is sometimes described as the first detective novel, and I think it's a fair supposition. even though there's no actual detective in Emma, and even though the mysteries involved in the plot are mainly internal mysteries of the heart, Austen does pioneer the form of narrative that mystery writers would go on to repeat continually in their work, and continue to repeat today with great success. Austen also pioneers another narrative form in Emma, which I think is even more impressive, and that's the genre of stream of consciousness. Today, that term, stream of consciousness, refers to a literary technique in which the author reveals the minds of her characters by providing a running monologue of what is occurring in their heads. It's a style of writing that's associated with many of the early modern writers, such as Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, but Austen uses the same technique, albeit in a slightly different form, in Emma. She applies it not to an internal monologue, but to an external dialogue between two characters, and she uses it to highlight those characters' buried motivations and their subconscious desires. She does this in several different sections of the book, but the most impressive and most comic example of it takes place at the end of Volume 2. It's Volume 2, Chapter 18, if your copy follows the original layout of the book, or Chapter 36, if it follows a modern layout. Most of this chapter is basically just one long conversation between two characters, Mr. Weston and Mrs. Elton. Mrs. Elton, I should add, is introduced later on in the novel. After Emma has rejected Mr. Elton's proposal of marriage, he goes off to visit some friends in Bath, and by the time he's returned to Highbury, he's married somebody else. The lady in question, the former Miss Augusta Hawkins, is the closest thing that Emma has to a nemesis. She's a gloriously awful character. Not dramatically evil, but just extremely irritating. She's very vain, very self-satisfied, and Mrs. Elton's chief aim in any social interaction is to win praise for herself and admiration from those around her. This is what she spends the whole of Chapter 36 trying to accomplish in her conversation with Mr. Weston. She's desperate for his praise and admiration. Mr. Weston, by contrast, is desperate for praise and admiration, not for himself, but for his son, Frank. It's revealed early on in the book that, as a young widower, Mr. Weston gave up the care of his son to his sister and brother-in-law. And although Austen doesn't specifically spell it out, she makes it very clear through Mr. Weston's behaviour and dialogue that he feels residual guilt about giving his son away at an early age, and consequently he's very anxious to affirm that Frank has grown up into a very fine and splendid young man. Mrs. Elton, meanwhile, is anxious to affirm her own social standing and her own marvellousness, because she's the daughter of a fairly lowly tradesman, and she's desperate to rise up in the world and be seen as a leader of fashion and society. So there's this ongoing dialogue between the two where both characters have very different motivations and are both very keen to direct the conversation towards the fulfillment of their individual needs. So they spend a lot of time talking at cross purposes, and a lot of time trying to snatch the topic of the conversation away from the other one and wrangle it to their own purposes. And the result is a superb example of two people who are both allowing their subconscious needs and desires to override their public behaviour. It's a beautifully observed chapter. There's hardly any narrative intervention from Austen at all. She just lets the characters talk, and they ramble on, apparently on fairly trivial topics, and yet from this conversation we learn so much about both of the respective characters, their insecurities, and their secret wants and needs. I think it was very brave and very innovative of Austen to devote an entire chapter to one conversation in this way, and her handling of it marks it out as a brilliant literary highlight in the book that also happens to be extremely funny and very insightful. Another delicious psychological development that occurs as a result of Mrs. Elton coming to live at Highbury with her new husband is that she and Emma develop a polite but intense feud. And this happens, of course, because really, on some level, Emma and Mrs. Elton are very similar. They're both conceited, they're both snobbish, they're both very judgmental of others, they're both very full of what they consider to be their own superior talents. And because of this, they end up absolutely loathing each other, because both of them think of themselves as the social queen of Highbury. So you get this lovely development within the novel where Emma is furiously criticising Mrs. Elton to her close circle of friends, and Mrs. Elton is backhandedly criticising Emma to her friends and acquaintances within the village. And both of them are completely oblivious to the fact that the characteristics that they loathe in each other are actually characteristics that they share themselves. However, there is nonetheless a profound difference between the two of them, because underneath all her flaws and foibles, Emma does actually have a very good heart. She's kind, she's generous, and she's capable of feeling humility and making changes in her behaviour. Mrs. Elton, by contrast, remains Mrs. Elton, self-absorbed, shallow, and showing affection only in a very narcissistic way, as a means of receiving praise and affirmation in turn for herself. And this is actually what makes Emma Woodhouse, in the end, I think, such a ultimately successful heroine, because she does learn from her mistakes, and she does acknowledge her flaws and change. There's no doubt about it that she is quite an irritating character, especially to begin with, and she comes out with some corkingly ironic statements, simply because she can't see past the end of her own nose a lot of the time, and isn't capable of applying the judgments she makes upon others to her own behaviour. However, when her faults are pointed out to her, which is usually by Mr. Knightley, she does acknowledge and accept them, and when the motivations of her own heart are finally revealed to her, she responds to them not with pride or resentment, but with genuine humility and love. And I think that's what makes Emma such a great novel, actually. Beneath the breezy wit and the hilarious satire, there's actually a very absorbing story of human development, insight, and growth. Emma's also one of those novels that every time I read it, I find I don't want it to end. And that's because Austen writes each of her characters so truthfully. They really step off the page and become alive for the reader. So as you progress through the novel, you become very engaged with the gossiping Miss Bates, the querulous Mr. Woodhouse, the charming Frank Churchill, and the ditzy but lovable Harriet Smith. All of these people have become real for you, and so you want to continue in their company. You want to remain in Highbury and just hang out with this beautifully observed little community. So saying goodbye to them at the end of the novel is always something of a wrench, for me at least. By the time Emma was published in 1815, Austen's popularity was great enough to have attracted the attention of the Prince Regent, who would later become George IV. and so she was encouraged to dedicate Emma to him. She did this in spite of her general lack of enthusiasm for the Prince Regent, and it became another success for her. Some early critics were puzzled by the novel's apparent lack of story, bearing in mind that Austen was writing at a time when most authors were still relying on external action and melodramatic plot points to further their narratives. So the fact that there weren't any audacious adventures in the novel disappointed some contemporary readers at the time. However, the Irish poet Thomas Moore wrote to a friend that Emma is the very perfection of novel writing, and the novelist and poet Sir Walter Scott commented in his review that the author's knowledge of the world and the peculiar tact with which she presents characters that the reader cannot fail to recognise reminds us something of the merits of the Flemish school of painting. The subjects are not often elegant, and certainly never grand, but they are finished up to nature and with a precision which delights the reader. I tend to agree with this evaluation by Scott, and Emma has been continuing to delight its readers ever since 1815. In the past few decades, there have been several screen adaptations of the novel. Of these, the most successful have been a film that was made in 1996 and starred Gwyneth Paltrow as Emma, and a made-for-TV miniseries that dates from 2009 and starred Romola Gary in the title role. Both of these adaptations are very enjoyable and largely faithful to the book. However, I also think that any list of screen versions of Emma should include an honourable mention for Clueless, which was made in 1995 and is a very clever film adaptation that transposes the plot of Emma to a modern-day American high school. There's also a brand new film version of Emma coming out this month, as I record, which is to say February 2020. I haven't yet seen this adaptation because it hasn't yet been released where I live, so I can't make any comment on it. But I'm looking forward to seeing what the director, Autumn de Wilde, has done with the story. However, in my humble opinion, I don't think any of the adaptations, however good they are quite as satisfying as reading the actual book, because it's simply a delightfully funny story and a very engaging exploration of the human heart and human foibles and frailties. With its brilliant insights, dazzling humour, comical characters, and incredibly sly plot twists, it's the perfect literary pick-me-up and well worth spending time with. So, this brings me to the end of my ramble about Jane Austen's Emma, and I hope you've enjoyed exploring the novel with me. I hope too that you can join me again soon for another ASMR adventure, and until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.